Morning was breaking in the Philippines with its golden rays reflecting on Manila Bay, while Manny Pacquiao drove peacefully after one of his morning training sessions. The famous boxer, senator, and Filipino national icon contemplated the urban landscape of the capital, observing the contrast between modern skyscrapers and the simple communities spreading across the horizon. His thoughts oscillated between the political responsibilities awaiting him in the Senate and memories of his own childhood in General Santos City, where he had known extreme poverty and the temptations that surrounded hopeless youth. At that same moment, on the other side of the city, Arjon Talimao, a 19-year-old with tired eyes and slumped shoulders, walked through the narrow streets of the Tondo neighborhood, known for its poverty and drug problems. His thin, pale face carried the marks of sleepless nights and choices that dragged him deeper and deeper. The son of a washerwoman and a fisherman who had died when he was only 8, Arjon had dropped out of school 2 years earlier to help support his 3 younger siblings. But unemployment and bad company led him into the world of shabu, the methamphetamine that devastated entire communities in the Philippines. Fate, with its mysterious tapestry of coincidences, wove the paths of those 2 very different souls on that Wednesday morning. Manny had decided to make an unplanned detour to visit an old gym where he had trained in his early years in Manila, a simple place hidden among alleys in the heart of Tondo. The boxer occasionally felt the need to reconnect with his roots, to remember the hungry boy he once was, as a way to stay humble despite all the fame and fortune he had achieved. Meanwhile, Arjon was running desperately through those same alleys, fleeing from Danilo Daga Macareg, a local drug dealer to whom he owed money for unpaid drugs. With his heart racing and breathing heavily, the young man turned a corner and violently collided with an athletic man exiting the old gym. The force of the impact made Arjon fall to the ground, scattering from his pocket some packets of shabu and a small rusty pocket knife he carried for protection. Raising his frightened eyes, the young addict immediately recognized the face of the man he had collided with. It was Manny Pacquiao, the champion everyone in the Philippines admired, the man who had defeated poverty with his fists and determination. The moment froze in time as the gazes of the 2 men met, Manny's serene and compassionate eyes against Arjon's frightened and desperate ones. The boxer immediately noticed the signs of addiction on the young man's face, recognizing the same traits he had seen in so many others in the poor communities he visited as a senator. Instead of backing away or calling the authorities, Manny extended his hand to help Arjon up, a simple gesture but loaded with humanity that completely disconcerted the young drug user. Behind them, threatening voices were rapidly approaching. Danilo and his 2 henchmen had followed Arjon's trail there. Panic overtook the young man, who began to visibly tremble, his thin body shaking like a leaf in the wind. Without hesitation, Manny perceived the situation, and with the same decision he demonstrated in the ring, led Arjon into the gym, closing the heavy metal door behind them. The place was practically empty at that hour of the morning, with only a few young boxers training under the supervision of an old trainer who immediately recognized Pacquiao and greeted him with respect. Within the temporary safety of the gym, Manny observed more carefully the young man trembling before him. Despite his appearance deteriorated by addiction, there was something in Arjon's eyes that reminded Manny of himself in his youth, an almost extinguished spark of determination, a last thread of hope amid despair. The boxer led the young man to a bench in the corner of the gym, away from the few present, and sat beside him without asking questions, only offering a bottle of water and waiting for the boy to calm down. The silence between them spoke more than 1,000 words, filled only by the rhythmic sound of punching bags being hit and the grunts of the young fighters training on the other side of the gym. Arjon drank the water eagerly, his still trembling hands holding the bottle while trying to process what was happening. He, a nobody, an addict chased by drug dealers, was sitting next to the great Manny Pacquiao, who had saved him without asking questions. Reality seemed distorted, as if he were living a feverish dream induced by drugs, but the hard bench under his thin body and the boxer's gentle gaze were undeniably real. Manny Pacquiao knew well the story of countless young men like Arjon, as he himself had grown up surrounded by similar temptations in General Santos City. While observing the young man beside him, He remembered childhood friends who had succumbed to addiction, wasted lives that could have followed different paths if they had found the right guidance at the right time. The boxer had dedicated part of his fortune and influence to combat the drug problem in the Philippines, not only as a senator, but also through rehabilitation programs and sports centers that offered alternatives for vulnerable youth. After a few moments of respectful silence, Manny began to share his own story with Arjon, not as the world champion or influential politician, but as the boy who sold cigarettes on the streets to help his family survive. He spoke about the nights he slept on the street, about days when hunger was so intense it physically hurt, about the temptations he faced and the friends he lost to violence and drugs. There was no judgment in his words, only the deep understanding of someone who had known the desperation of poverty and found a way out of it. Arjon listened in silence, tears flowing freely down his thin face as Manny's story resonated in his own heart. The young man had never imagined that his idol, the great Pac-Man, could have faced circumstances so similar to his own. Gradually, he felt safe enough to share his own story. The death of his fisherman father during a storm, his mother Marisol's daily struggle to feed 4 children by washing clothes, the little siblings who still believed he worked as a night security guard, not knowing that the money he occasionally brought home came from selling drugs to support his own addiction. Time seemed suspended in that corner of the old gym, as 2 seemingly different souls discovered how much they had in common. Manny listened attentively to each word from Arjon, recognizing the genuine pain behind the addiction, the young man who still existed beneath the scars of drug abuse. When Arjon finally finished his account, both remained silent for a few moments, the air between them charged with contained emotion. It was then that Manny Pacquiao made a decision that would forever change the life of both. He offered Arjon a chance not out of pity or charity, but because he saw in the boy the same potential that others had seen in him decades ago. Manny's proposal was simple, but would require from Arjon a courage greater than the young man had ever needed to demonstrate. The boxer offered him a place in a rehabilitation program that he himself financed, followed by training at Pacquiao's own gym and the possibility of employment in one of the champion's associated companies. In exchange, Arjon would need to fully commit to his recovery, definitively abandoning drugs and bad company. It would not be an easy path, withdrawal syndrome confronting his own internal demons, and the resistance from his environment would represent formidable challenges. Faced with the most important crossroads of his young life, Arjon felt a mixture of hope and terror. Part of him desperately yearned for that chance at a fresh start, for the possibility of becoming someone his mother and siblings could truly admire. Another part, however, the part dominated by addiction, screamed that he would not be capable, that the pain of withdrawal would be unbearable, that he did not deserve help from someone like Manny Pacquiao. The internal conflict was reflected on his face, in eyes that alternated between a glimmer of hope and a shadow of despair. Manny patiently observed Arjon's internal battle, recognizing each emotion that passed across the young man's face. The boxer knew that the decision needed to come from the boy's own heart. Any external imposition would be doomed to failure. Gently, he placed his hand on Arjon's bony shoulder and spoke about the importance of family, about how his own children and mother had been his strength in the most difficult moments, about how true victory was not in titles or money, but in the ability to rise after each fall. Manny's words hit Arjon like precise blows, not to hurt, but to awaken. The young man thought of his mother Marisol, who still woke before dawn to wash clothes despite fingers already deformed by hard work, of his younger siblings, Elijah aged 15, Rosanna aged 12, and little Paolo just 9, who still looked at him with admiration despite his increasingly frequent absences. In a moment of clarity that seemed a miracle amid the constant fog in which he lived, Arjon found himself facing a chance he had never imagined receiving. With a voice choked with emotion and hands still trembling, the young man accepted Manny's proposal in a decision that would require all his strength in the days to come. The first days at the rehabilitation center were a personal hell for Arjon. His body, dependent on shabu, violently protested against forced abstinence. Night sweats soaked his sheets, uncontrollable tremors shook his limbs, and overwhelming anxiety kept him awake for hours. Curled up in fetal position in the small room he shared with another young man in recovery. In the worst moments, when the desire to flee and seek drugs seemed unbearable, Arjon clung to the memory of Manny Pacquiao's gaze, to the confidence the champion had placed in him without truly knowing him. The medical team at the center, personally chosen by Pacquiao, combined professionalism with genuine compassion. Dr. Isabella Reyes, a psychiatrist specializing in chemical dependency, conducted daily sessions with Arjon, helping him identify the emotional triggers that led to his drug abuse. The head nurse, Ramon Buenaventura, remained by the young man's side during the most intense withdrawal crises, his silent and strong presence conveying security in moments of greatest despair. Slowly, day by day, Arjon began to recover, not only his physical health, but also the mental clarity that addiction had obscured for so long. Manny Pacquiao did not disappear after leaving Arjon at the rehabilitation center as the young man had initially feared. Despite an overloaded schedule with political and sporting commitments, the boxer visited the center regularly, always reserving time to speak personally with Arjon. During these conversations, Manny shared not only stories of overcoming adversity, but also his own vulnerabilities and doubts, showing the young man that even the most admired idols faced internal battles. During one of these visits, Pacquiao brought with him a surprise that moved Arjon to tears: his mother, Marisol, and his 3 younger siblings. The family reunion, carefully organized by Manny and the therapeutic team, was a milestone in Arjon's recovery. Marisol, a small woman with calloused hands and gentle eyes, embraced her son with surprising strength for her fragile body, whispering words of love and forgiveness in his ear. The siblings, initially shy and confused, soon surrounded Arjon with questions and awkward hugs. To the young man's surprise, his family had been welcomed by a foundation linked to Pacquiao, which now guaranteed decent housing and scholarships for the younger siblings. At that moment, surrounded by the love that had always been there but that addiction had prevented him from fully seeing, Arjon felt a renewed determination to continue with his recovery, not just for himself, but for all those who believed in him. After 3 intense months at the rehabilitation center, Arjon began the second phase of the plan outlined by Manny Pacquiao. With his body still thin but already free of the toxins that had poisoned it, the young man started to attend the boxer's personal gym in Manila. Initially, the environment intimidated Arjon. Modern equipment, professional fighters training intensely, and occasionally Pacquiao himself preparing for exhibition commitments or personally supervising the training. However, against all his expectations, no one there treated him with contempt or distrust. Under direct guidance from Buboy Fernandez, Manny's childhood friend and assistant trainer, Arjon began a rigorous routine that combined physical conditioning, proper nutrition, and, to his surprise, basic boxing lessons. The first weeks were extremely difficult, with unaccustomed muscles protesting against simple exercises that professional fighters executed with ease. Arjon frequently ended training exhausted, with his body aching and breathing labored, questioning if he really had the capacity for this new life. However, each small progress, 1 more minute on the punching bag, a complete series of push-ups, a discreet compliment from Buboy, fueled his perseverance. Gradually, the young man who had arrived at the gym as a walking skeleton began to develop defined muscles, physical resistance, and, more importantly, confidence in his own abilities. Boxing became more than just an exercise for Arjon. It transformed into a form of therapy, a way to channel the repressed anger, frustration, and resentment that had fueled his addiction for so long. Each blow to the bag represented an internal demon being faced. Each defensive movement symbolized his newly discovered ability to protect himself from the temptations of the outside world. On the rare occasions when Manny Pacquiao personally held the training gloves for Arjon, the young man felt an indescribable mixture of gratitude, admiration, and determination that propelled him beyond his apparent limits. Parallel to physical training, Arjon resumed the studies he had interrupted years before. Tutors hired by Pacquiao's foundation helped him prepare for high school equivalency exams, paving the way for possible higher education in the future. The nights that were once dedicated to drugs and self-destruction were now filled with books, exercises, and increasingly concrete dreams. In a particularly significant conversation after intense training, Manny surprised Arjon by asking him about his long-term plans and aspirations. The young man, who a few months ago could barely think about the next day, found himself seriously reflecting on careers, goals, and the legacy he would like to build, a silent but profound transformation in his way of seeing his own future. 6. Months after the fateful encounter in the alleys of Tondo, Arjon's transformation was evident to everyone around him. The skeletal and desperate young man had given way to a man in formation with a healthy body, clear and determined gaze, and a smile that no longer hid in shame. Although he still occasionally faced anxiety crises and moments of doubt, Arjon had developed healthy mechanisms to deal with his emotions, replacing drugs with physical activity, meditation taught by Manny, and the constant support of the therapeutic group he continued to attend weekly. The relationship between Arjon and Manny Pacquiao had evolved into something that surprised them both. What had begun as an act of compassion from a national idol had transformed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences. Manny found in Arjon a living reminder of his own journey and the importance of extending a hand to the most vulnerable. Arjon, in turn, saw in Pacquiao not just the world champion or influential politician, but a mentor and tangible example that humble origins do not determine a person's final destiny. The true test of Arjon's recovery, however, would come unexpectedly. During a charity event organized by Pacquiao's foundation in Tondo, the young man found himself face-to-face with his past in the figure of Danilo "Dagger" Macaraeg, the drug dealer from whom he had fled on that fateful day. The man, visibly aged and embittered after a brief stint in prison, approached Arjon with a mixture of surprise and disdain. The event security moved quickly to intervene, but Arjon, with a calmness he never imagined possessing, made a discreet gesture indicating he could handle the situation. The brief dialogue that followed represented the closing of a cycle for Arjon. Without arrogance but with firmness, he faced the man who had once terrified him, now seeming curiously smaller and less threatening. Arjon didn't need many words. His presence at that event, alongside Manny Pacquiao, his healthy appearance, and the foundation symbol he discreetly carried on his badge, told the story of his transformation more eloquently than any speech. At the end of the encounter, it was Danilo who first averted his gaze, walking away with his head down while muttering something inaudible. At that moment, Arjon realized he had achieved a more significant victory than any that could occur in a ring. Victory over his own fears and over the cycle of self-destruction that had almost consumed his life. 1 year after the encounter that had changed his life, Arjon Talimau was unrecognizable to those who had known him in the dark times of addiction. The young man now held a position as an administrative assistant in Manny Pacquiao's foundation, specifically responsible for coordinating the rehabilitation and social reintegration program for young drug dependents. The organizational skills he had developed, combined with his personal experience and the technical course in administration he had recently completed, made him a valuable collaborator for the organization. On weekends, Arjon volunteered as a technical assistant in the boxing project for vulnerable youth, thus returning the opportunity he had received. Arjon's family was also experiencing a profound transformation. Marisol, his mother, had finally been able to abandon the exhausting work as a washerwoman to dedicate herself to a small sewing business, financed by a microcredit program of the foundation. Elijah, the older brother, stood out in his studies and already spoke of studying medicine, inspired by the medical team that had accompanied Arjon's recovery. Rosanna and Paolo flourished in school with exemplary grades, free from the shadow of concern that previously hung over the family. The simple but dignified house where they now lived, located in a safe neighborhood in Manila, materially symbolized the change in trajectory that had begun with that seemingly casual encounter in the alleys of Tondo. On a special afternoon during the inauguration of a new sports center of the foundation, Manny Pacquiao surprised all those present by inviting Arjan to join him on stage. With visible emotion, the world champion briefly shared the young man's story, omitting unnecessary details, but emphasizing the courage and determination that Arjan had demonstrated in his recovery journey. To Arjan's astonishment, Pacquiao announced that the young man had been selected for an international exchange program, where he would represent the Philippines at a global conference on drug combat policies and rehabilitation of chemical dependence. The opportunity not only recognized Arjan's dedicated work at the foundation, but also opened doors for his professional and personal development at a level he had never imagined possible. As applause echoed through the packed auditorium, Arjan felt an almost indescribable emotion overwhelm him. Silent tears ran down his face as he observed his mother and siblings in the front row, their faces illuminated by proud smiles. Beside him, Manny Pacquiao, the man who had literally altered the course of his life, squeezed his shoulder in a silent gesture of recognition. In a moment of crystal clarity, Arjan understood that his story was not just about personal redemption, but about the transformative power of an act of genuine compassion. What had begun as a casual encounter between a world champion and a young man lost in the darkness of addiction had transformed into a living testimony of hope for others who still fought against their own demons. That night, upon returning to his small apartment and reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year, Arjan made a silent but deeply significant decision. Just as Manny Pacquiao had extended his hand to him in his most desperate moment, he would dedicate his life to doing the same for others. The debt of gratitude, he felt, could not be repaid only to Manny but needed to be passed forward, creating a virtuous cycle that would counterbalance the vicious cycle from which he had escaped. With this firm resolution in his heart, Arjan fell, asleep with a peace he had never known before, prepared to face any challenge the future might bring, no longer as a victim of circumstances, but as the protagonist of his own story. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.